In the fields of central Ukraine, two entire Soviet armies vanished in less than 3 weeks, leaving more than 100,000 men walking into captivity. The disaster at Uman did not just break the southwestern front, it opened the road to Kiev and triggered a chain of encirclements that reshaped the war in 1941. What really happened inside the collapsing pocket, and why was this defeat almost erased from history for decades? By the summer of 1941, the political and military landscape of Eastern Europe had been radically reshaped by nearly 2 years of instability triggered by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 and the subsequent division of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. The temporary cooperation between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union had allowed both powers to expand territorially, but it also concealed deep structural mistrust. By early 1941, German strategic planning was fully oriented toward a large-scale military confrontation with the Soviet Union. On 18 December 1940, Adolf Hitler issued Directive No. 21, known as Operation Barbarossa, outlining the plan for the invasion of the USSR. The primary objective was the destruction of the Red Army in Western Soviet territories within a short campaign lasting several months. At the diplomatic level, relations between Berlin and Moscow had deteriorated throughout 1940. Disputes over influence in the Balkans, access to the Turkish Straits, and economic deliveries under existing trade agreements increased tensions. German intelligence assessed that the Soviet Union was rearming rapidly but underestimated the depth of its mobilization potential. Soviet leadership, in turn, received repeated warnings from foreign intelligence services about the impending invasion, but interpreted German troop movements along the western border as coercive diplomacy rather than a finalized deployment for immediate war. On the military level, the Red Army entered 1941 amid an incomplete reorganization. Between 1937 and 1938, the Soviet officer corps had been severely disrupted by purges that removed thousands of experienced commanders. Although partial recovery occurred by 1940, many formations on the western frontier were still commanded by recently promoted officers with limited battlefield coordination experience. At the same time, the Red Army was expanding rapidly. By June 1941, it fielded approximately 5 million active duty personnel, of whom about 2.7 million were deployed in western military districts. The Southwestern Front, covering most of Ukraine, included the Kiev Special Military District, with roughly 900,000 troops, over 5,500 tanks, and more than 3,000 combat aircraft assigned on paper. German forces assembled for the invasion totaled approximately 3.3 million personnel in the initial assault wave, supported by around 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 2,000 aircraft. In the southern operational sector, which directly affected Ukraine, Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt concentrated roughly 57 divisions, including 9 Panzer and 5 motorized divisions. Their core striking force consisted of the 1st Panzer Group under General Ewald von Kleist, the German 6th Army under General Walter von Reichenau, and Allied Romanian formations operating on the southern flank. Strategically, Ukraine represented one of the central objectives of the German campaign. The region's agricultural output, industrial base in the Dnieper Basin, and access routes toward the Caucasus made it a priority for both economic and operational reasons. Control of Ukrainian territory would also deprive the Soviet Union of critical manpower and food reserves. For Soviet planners, Ukraine was equally vital as the western gateway to the industrial heartland and the Black Sea Basin. As a result, both sides committed large concentrations of forces to the region even before hostilities began. Public sentiment in western Ukraine in June 1941 was shaped by the memory of Soviet annexation in 1939-1940 and by widespread repression carried out by Soviet security organs. This complex societal background influenced early civilian reactions to the invasion, but played only a limited role in immediate operational outcomes around Uman. More decisive were structural military factors, deployment density, command integration, and the balance between mechanized and infantry formations. By the third week of June 1941, German forward units were positioned along the entire western border of the Soviet Union, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Soviet border troops and covering armies occupied forward defensive zones under directives that emphasized avoiding provocations. At dawn on 22 June 1941, without a formal declaration of war, German forces initiated the largest land invasion in modern history. Within the first 48 hours, German panzer formations penetrated up to 70 kilometers into Soviet territory in several sectors. In the southwestern direction, this initial shock set in motion a sequence of encirclement operations that would, within 7 weeks, culminate in the disaster near the Ukrainian town of Uman. On 22 June 1941, at 03:15 local time, German Army Group South launched its opening assault across the Soviet border into western Ukraine. The initial strike involved coordinated attacks by the German 1st Panzer Group, the 6th Army, and Romanian armies advancing from Bessarabia. In the first 24 hours, German air forces carried out over 1,600 sorties in the southern sector, targeting Soviet airfields, rail junctions, and forward command posts. Soviet air losses in the Kiev Special Military District on the first day are estimated at more than 800 aircraft destroyed, the majority on the ground. The first Soviet formations to absorb the impact were units of the 5th, 6th, 12th, and 26th Armies deployed along the western frontier of Ukraine. These armies were positioned in forward defensive zones under operational doctrines that discouraged preemptive maneuvers. When the German attack began, many Soviet rifle divisions were still in march columns or in temporary encampments without fully prepared field fortifications. Communication lines between front-level command and individual armies were disrupted within the first 12 hours as German airstrikes destroyed radio relays and telephone exchanges. On 23-24 June, German panzer formations achieved rapid penetrations along multiple axes. The 1st Panzer Group advanced through Lutsk, Dubno, and Brody, engaging large Soviet mechanized formations in one of the first mass tank battles of the war. Between 24 and 30 June, the Soviet Southwestern Front committed 5 mechanized corps containing more than 2,500 tanks into a counteroffensive effort west of Rovno. German armored forces, numbering approximately 750 tanks in this sector, absorbed the engagement with support from close air operations and coordinated artillery. By 1 July, Soviet mechanized units had lost an estimated 60-70% of operational vehicles due to combat destruction, mechanical failure, and fuel shortages. Following the failure of the armored counterstrikes, German forces resumed forward momentum. On 2 July, the German 1st Panzer Group crossed the Zbruch River, breaking the Soviet covering line protecting the approaches to central Ukraine. The German 6th Army advanced in parallel to the north, securing river crossings and isolating Soviet rear formations that failed to withdraw in time. Soviet Supreme Command issued multiple orders for organized retreat toward the Stalin Line and the Dnieper defensive belt, but simultaneous communication breakdowns and the speed of German mobile forces prevented full execution of these directives. By 7 to 8 July, the operational situation in the southwestern direction shifted from border defense to large-scale maneuver warfare. German armored spearheads reached the approaches to Zhytomyr and Berdichev, while Romanian forces pushed eastward along the Black Sea littoral. Soviet 6th and 12th Armies positioned south of Kiev began falling back under constant pressure, attempting to reorient their defense along secondary river lines such as the Southern Bug. However, shortages of transport and persistent air attacks disrupted the movement of supply columns and artillery units. On 10 July, German forward units crossed the Southern Bug north of Pervomaisk after brief engagement with Soviet rear guards. This crossing marked the opening of the deep operational space toward Uman and the interior of central Ukraine. At this stage, the Soviet Southwestern Front still retained significant manpower, over 600,000 troops, but its formations were increasingly fragmented. Army-level coordination deteriorated as retreating units mixed with rear area detachments and newly mobilized conscripts moving toward the front. The German command identified the growing gap between the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies as a decisive opportunity. On 14th of July, the 1st Panzer Group redirected 2 armored corps southeastward with the objective of forcing a wide encirclement in the region between the southern Bug and Dniester rivers. Infantry divisions of the 17th Army followed to consolidate captured territory and secure supply routes. Soviet efforts to establish a new continuous defense along the Bug collapsed within days due to the loss of heavy equipment and the exhaustion of reserve formations. By mid-July 1941, the Red Army in southern Ukraine was no longer conducting an organized front-wide defense, but a series of uncoordinated fighting withdrawals. German mobile forces continued to outpace Soviet retreat routes, capturing key road junctions and bridges in advance of the main Soviet columns. These developments set the operational conditions for a large encirclement maneuver that would fully materialize in the area east and south of Uman within the first week of August. By late July 1941, the operational focus in southern Ukraine had shifted from border penetration to deep encirclement. The German High Command assessed that the Red Army's southwestern front had suffered heavy material losses, but still retained large disorganized troop groupings attempting to retreat eastward. Rather than pursue a direct drive toward the Dnieper at this stage, German planners identified the operational priority as the destruction of these retreating Soviet forces west of the river. The region between the southern Bug, the Sinyuka, and the Dniester rivers offered conditions suitable for a large double envelopment. The German operational concept was shaped by established blitzkrieg doctrine, rapid armored breakthroughs, deep operational penetration, and closure of encirclement rings by mobile formations supported by advancing infantry. The main striking force remained the 1st Panzer Group under General Ewald von Kleist, reinforced by elements of the 17th Army, advancing from the west, and the 11th Army with Romanian support advancing from the south. The total German force involved in the projected encirclement maneuver toward Uman is estimated at approximately 300,000 troops, with around 700 to 750 operational tanks remaining after the July fighting. German logistical planning relied on rail conversion crews restoring captured Soviet broad-gauge tracks to standard gauge as quickly as possible. By late July, German supply depots had been established at Lvov, Vinnytsia, and Berdichev. However, supply lines were already stretched by distances exceeding 300 kilometers from the original border. Fuel availability was the critical limiting factor for armored units. Daily fuel deliveries to the 1st Panzer Group in late July averaged 1,900 to 2,200 cubic meters, barely sufficient to sustain continuous maneuver operations. On the Soviet side, strategic planning was increasingly reactive. The southwestern front attempted to stabilize a new defensive line along the Dnieper and the lower reaches of the Bug. Soviet Supreme Command Directive No. 0123 of 19th July ordered the 6th and 12th Armies to withdraw in stages toward the east and avoid encirclement at all costs. The directive emphasized the preservation of manpower for the defense of the industrial regions beyond the river. In practice, the execution of this order was compromised by contradictory instructions from front-level headquarters that prioritized holding specific towns and river crossings for political and symbolic reasons. The Soviet 6th Army under Lieutenant General Ivan Muzichenko and the 12th Army under Major General Pavel Ponedelin together still fielded approximately 250,000 to 280,000 personnel in late July, although these numbers included large rear service and partially armed units. Tank strength had been reduced to fewer than 350 operational vehicles combined, most of them light T-26 and BT series tanks suffering from fuel shortages and mechanical attrition. Artillery losses exceeded 60% of pre-war authorized strength. Soviet logistics in this sector deteriorated rapidly. Continuous Luftwaffe strikes on rail junctions at Shepetovka, Kazetin, and Zhmarinka disrupted eastward supply flows. Motor transport suffered catastrophic losses. By 25 July, several rifle divisions reported fewer than 20% of their authorized truck strength. Ammunition expenditures during rearguard fighting had not been matched by resupply. Food distribution to frontline units was reduced to one hot meal every 36 to 48 hours in several formations. German planners interpreted the growing Soviet logistical breakdown as confirmation that a large encirclement could be achieved within a narrow time window. On 26 July, Army Group South issued operational guidance for a converging maneuver. The 1st Panzer Group was to swing southeast toward Pervomaisk and Uman, while infantry divisions of the 17th Army advanced from the west and northwest to compress the pocket. Romanian units along the southern flank were tasked with blocking potential Soviet escape routes toward the lower Dniester. Propaganda planning accompanied the military preparations. German operational communiques emphasized the imminent destruction of large Soviet formations in Ukraine to reinforce the narrative of irreversible collapse. Soviet political messaging, by contrast, emphasized delaying actions and the need to trade space for time, though this narrative had limited influence on immediate tactical decisions at the front line. By 30th of July 1941, both sides had completed their principal operational preparations. German armored units refueled for another deep thrust, despite strained logistics. Soviet armies attempted to regroup under constant pressure with limited coordination. The decisive phase of maneuver warfare that would culminate in the encirclement near Uman was now set in motion. The first direct engagements that led toward the Uman encirclement unfolded between 1 and 4 August 1941 as German mobile formations accelerated southeastward into the depth of central Ukraine. On 1st August, forward elements of the 1st Panzer Group crossed the Sinyuka River near Novyi Bu after brief engagements with Soviet rearguards. These forces consisted primarily of the Avchintiv and XX 8 motorized corps, supported by mobile artillery and engineer battalions tasked with immediate bridge repair. German armored advance rates during these days ranged from 25 to 40 kilometers per day, depending on terrain and fuel availability. Soviet 6th and 12th Armies attempted to execute fighting withdrawals toward the east and southeast. However, their movements were constrained by limited transport, damaged road infrastructure, and the increasing loss of centralized command control. On 2nd August, Soviet counterattacks were conducted near the towns of Pervomaisk and Golovanivsk, using fragmented tank detachments and rifle battalions drawn from multiple divisions. These actions involved fewer than 90 operational tanks in total. The engagements disrupted German march columns temporarily, but failed to halt the forward momentum of the panzer units. Soviet tank losses during the Pervomaisk actions exceeded 50 vehicles destroyed or abandoned due to fuel depletion. By 3rd of August, German forces captured Golovanivsk, a key junction controlling road access to Uman from the west and south. This development effectively cut one of the last organized Soviet withdrawal corridors. Infantry divisions of the German 17th Army advanced closely behind the panzer spearheads, securing captured road networks and eliminating bypassed Soviet rear formations. Luftwaffe aircraft conducted continuous interdiction missions along retreat routes east of the southern Bug, focusing on Soviet artillery columns and supply convoys. Soviet daily losses from air attack alone in this phase are estimated at 1,200 to 1,500 personnel, killed and wounded across both armies. Civilian displacement increased sharply as German forces moved into densely populated agricultural districts. Between 1 and 6 August, Soviet civil authorities evacuated approximately 45,000 civilians from settlements west of Uman, largely without mechanized transport. Large segments of the population fled on foot along the same road networks used by retreating Soviet units, further congesting movement and delaying artillery and medical convoys. No structured evacuation plan existed for the rural district population. On 4th August, Soviet command attempted to establish a temporary defensive perimeter along the upper reaches of the Yatran River, south of Uman. This line was held primarily by depleted rifle divisions of the 12th Army, supported by ad hoc artillery groupings. Defensive positions lacked depth and field fortifications due to time constraints. German reconnaissance units detected these positions within hours. By the evening of the same day, German motorized infantry supported by direct-fire artillery penetrated the Yatran line at 2 points, forcing Soviet units to withdraw again under pressure. The territorial situation shifted rapidly. By the end of 4th August, German forward elements had advanced to within 15 to 20 kilometers west and southwest of Uman. At the same time, Romanian formations advancing from the south secured blocking positions along the lower Bug tributaries, limiting Soviet ability to redirect retreat toward the Black Sea hinterland. The combined effect of these movements narrowed the operational space available to the two Soviet armies to a corridor less than 40 kilometers wide. Morale among Soviet frontline units deteriorated as command links failed. Several rifle divisions reported being without formal contact with front headquarters for periods exceeding 48 hours. Unit cohesion increasingly depended on battalion and company-level leadership. German morale remained operationally stable, though fuel consumption exceeded planned rates due to detours around destroyed bridges and damaged road surfaces. By the first week of August 1941, the clash phase had produced irreversible spatial outcomes. Soviet forces had failed to establish a continuous, defensible river line. German mobile units had secured the key junctions west and south of Uman and were now in position to execute the final closure of the encirclement against the retreating Soviet 6th and 12th Armies. Between 5 and 8 of August 1941, the operational situation of the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies entered a phase of acute crisis as the German encirclement rapidly tightened around the Uman region. On 5th August, German armored columns advancing from the northwest linked operationally with blocking formations advancing from the south, reducing the width of the remaining Soviet-controlled corridor to less than 25 kilometers. Continuous Luftwaffe strikes targeted all visible movement within this shrinking pocket, focusing on road intersections, river crossings, and artillery concentrations. Soviet air cover in the area had effectively ceased by this stage, with fewer than 40 operational aircraft available to support both armies combined. At the same time, Soviet command faced a breakdown in coordinated control. On 6 August, communications between the Southwestern Front headquarters and both armies were intermittently lost for periods lasting up to 12 hours. Orders issued to execute a coordinated breakout toward the southeast arrived fragmented, delayed, or not at all. Several rifle divisions began independent withdrawals based on local assessments rather than front-level directives. This disintegration of centralized command caused movement streams of multiple divisions to collide on the same narrow road axes, leading to traffic jams extending up to 10 kilometers in length in several sectors east of Pervomysk. German forces exploited this congestion with methodical artillery fire and aerial bombardment. On 6th August alone, German air units in the Uman sector flew approximately 480 sorties. Soviet daily losses from air attack during 5–7 August are estimated at 4,000 to 5,000 killed and wounded across both armies. Vehicle losses were even more damaging. By 7th August, fewer than 15% of the original authorized motor transport of the two armies remained operational. Fuel shortages caused widespread abandonment of intact vehicles and artillery pieces. On the Soviet side, attempts were made to mount organized counterattacks to reopen the collapsing corridor. On 7th August, elements of the 6th Army launched a coordinated thrust near Podvysok involving remnants of 3 rifle divisions and approximately 25 surviving tanks. The attack achieved initial penetration of several German security battalions, but was halted within hours by concentrated anti-tank artillery and flanking fire from German motorized infantry. Soviet tank losses in this action reached 18 vehicles destroyed. Infantry casualties exceeded 1,000 men. German infantry formations of the 17th Army steadily compressed the perimeter from the west, while Romanian units extended blocking operations along the southern arc. The German operational objective had fully shifted from pursuit to containment and annihilation. Between 6 and 8 August, German units completed the capture of Novokangelsk and several smaller settlements east of the southern Bug, sealing off the last organized Soviet withdrawal routes toward the east. The encirclement ring was now functionally closed. Civilian conditions inside the forming pocket deteriorated rapidly. Approximately 70,000 civilians remained trapped in the rural districts south and east of Uman. Food requisitioning by retreating Soviet units intensified due to supply collapse. Local medical infrastructure was incapable of addressing the rapidly growing number of wounded personnel and displaced residents. Reports from district authorities indicated that by 8 August, Organized civilian governance had ceased in most of the encircled villages. Morale among Soviet troops reflected the operational collapse. Desertion rates increased sharply during this phase, particularly among rear service and transport personnel. At the same time, organized resistance remained present in several frontline rifle divisions, where unit cohesion was sustained through company-level command. German morale benefited from the perception that a complete encirclement was now imminent. However, German units also reported growing fatigue after continuous operations exceeding 6 weeks without extended rest. By the evening of 8 August 1941, the crisis phase had reached its decisive threshold. The Soviet 6th and 12th Armies were fully compressed into a limited operational space centered on the area south of Uman, with no secure eastward withdrawal routes remaining. The next phase would no longer be defined by maneuver or escape attempts, but by the final destruction of the trapped forces. Between 9 and 12 August 1941, the fighting in the Uman pocket reached its maximum intensity as German forces initiated the final compression and destruction of the encircled Soviet 6th and 12th Armies. By this stage, the encirclement ring extended roughly 60 kilometers in circumference, enclosing an area of approximately 1,000 square kilometers. Inside the pocket, Soviet forces still numbered between 100,000 and 120,000 personnel, though fewer than half were fully combat capable. Heavy weapons had largely been lost. Fewer than 60 operational tanks and under 200 artillery pieces remained inside the encirclement by 9 August. German command concentrated the main reduction effort along the northeastern and western arcs, where the terrain allowed the most effective convergence of infantry and artillery. On 9 August, the German 17th Army launched a coordinated series of attacks supported by over 300 artillery pieces and heavy mortars. The bombardment began at 05:30 and continued for nearly 3 hours, firing an estimated 18,000 rounds into Soviet defensive zones established along shallow ridgelines and forest belts south of Uman. Soviet field fortifications in this area were improvised and lacked depth. Within the first day, German infantry advanced between 6 and 9 kilometers into the pocket. Soviet resistance during this phase was fragmented but persistent in localized sectors. Several rifle regiments conducted delaying actions from tree lines and village outskirts, often without artillery support. Ammunition shortages were severe. Interrogations later recorded that some Soviet units had fewer than 10 rifle cartridges per man at the peak of the fighting. Medical evacuation had become impossible. Wounded personnel were transported on carts or left in improvised shelters within destroyed farm buildings. On 10 August, German panzer elements from the 1st Panzer Group executed limited thrusts into the interior of the pocket to accelerate collapse rather than pursue classic deep penetration. Approximately 120 tanks were committed in this phase. These advances targeted command clusters and remaining Soviet artillery concentrations near Podvysok and Kopinkovate. Several Soviet command posts were overrun within hours. Loss of centralized command became irreversible after midday on 10 August. Soviet attempts to organize a coordinated breakout during this phase collapsed under continuous German fire pressure. A final effort launched during the night of 10 to 11 August involved remnants of 4 rifle divisions attempting to force a passage eastward near the villages along the Sinyuka River. The assault force numbered approximately 14,000 men at the outset. By dawn on 11 August, fewer than 3,000 had reached the German outer screening lines. Most were killed, wounded, or captured in the open fields under machine gun and artillery fire. Civilian suffering intensified as fighting moved through densely populated agricultural zones. Villages inside the pocket changed hands repeatedly within hours. Food stocks were exhausted. Fires caused by artillery strikes destroyed large portions of wooden housing. By 11 August, civilian casualties inside the encirclement exceeded 8,000 killed and wounded since the closure of the pocket, based on later regional Soviet assessments. German casualties during the peak reduction phase remained lower in absolute numbers, but were steady. Between 9 and 12 August, German units reported approximately 1,300 killed and wounded across all formations involved in the compression. Soviet losses for the same four-day period are estimated at 25,000 to 30,000 killed and wounded, with an additional large number of captures occurring as organized resistance disintegrated. By the evening of 12 August 1941, the encircled Soviet formations no longer constituted coordinated armies. Resistance persisted only in isolated clusters around depleted artillery positions, headquarters remnants, and small infantry groupings attempting independent evasion. The largest operational destruction phase of the Uman disaster had been completed. After 12 August 1941, the character of the fighting inside the remains of the Uman pocket shifted from organized frontline combat to fragmented resistance, small group survival, and improvised evasion efforts. With centralized command destroyed and the structural integrity of both the 6th and 12th Armies eliminated, remaining Soviet personnel operated in isolated clusters ranging from several dozen to several hundred men. These groups were typically centered around surviving battalion commanders, political officers, or artillery crews, whose guns could no longer be repositioned due to lack of traction, fuel, or draft animals. Several attempts at local counterattacks occurred between 13 and 16 August, primarily in forested zones southeast of Podvysok. These actions were not coordinated at army level and lacked artillery preparation. A typical engagement involved 200-400 Soviet troops attempting surprise assaults against German infantry screening units. In one recorded action on 14 August, approximately 320 Soviet infantry attacked a German battalion perimeter near the village of Ternivka. The assault was repelled within 2 hours, with 96 Soviet casualties and 17 German casualties. Similar attempts were repeated throughout the area, but failed to alter the operational situation. Improvisation defined survival on both sides. Soviet groups dismantled damaged vehicles to extract food supplies, medical kits, and fabric for wound dressings. Civilian wells and irrigation canals became the primary water sources. Ammunition was rationed to individual shots rather than magazines. Several political officers recorded that rifle fire was limited to distances under 150 meters due to scarcity of cartridges. German units similarly adapted to prolonged operations under supply strain. Infantry companies reduced carried loads by abandoning heavy, non-essential equipment to maintain mobility in the broken terrain. Resistance took multiple forms. A growing number of Soviet soldiers began moving in small groups of 5 to 15 men at night, attempting independent eastward escape toward the Dnieper. Between 13 and 20 August, German rear area security reports documented the interception of over 9,000 such escape attempts. Of these, approximately 1,500 involved armed resistance, resulting in localized firefights. Most escape groups were captured due to exhaustion, injury, or navigation errors in unfamiliar terrain. Only a limited number succeeded in passing through German screening zones. Civilian participation in survival efforts intensified. In several districts, villagers concealed wounded Soviet personnel in basements, grain pits, and abandoned animal shelters. German countermeasures included systematic searches and the establishment of mobile inspection posts along forest movement corridors. Between 14 and 18 August, German security units conducted over 120 village sweeps inside the former pocket area. These operations led to the capture of several thousand dispersed Soviet soldiers and the removal of civilians suspected of providing shelter. Psychological degradation became increasingly visible. Soviet soldiers reported prolonged sleep deprivation, dehydration, and untreated trauma. Disciplinary structure dissolved entirely in most groups. At the same time, organized partisan-style behavior emerged spontaneously in forest zones near the Yatran and Sinyuka river valleys. These early formations operated independently of later formal partisan networks and lacked sustained supply access. Their actions were limited to isolated attacks on German supply patrols and communications lines. Recorded German losses from such actions between 15 and 25 August totaled fewer than 80 personnel. German forces adapted their own tactical pattern to this new phase. Large unit maneuvers were replaced by security grids, mobile patrol corridors, and layered detention zones. Infantry regiments were rotated into rear area security roles, while motorized units redeployed toward new frontline objectives to the east. The reduction of the pocket transitioned into a containment and collection operation rather than continued battlefield engagement. Morale patterns diverged sharply. Surviving Soviet groups exhibited fluctuating motivation that depended almost entirely on immediate leadership presence and access to food and water. German morale stabilized as the operational threat disappeared, though fatigue levels remained high after nearly 8 consecutive weeks of maneuver and reduction operations. By the third week of August 1941, resistance inside the former encirclement no longer possessed the structural characteristics of organized military opposition. What remained was a dispersed pattern of survival-based movement, localized fire contact, and systematic capture. The disaster had moved fully from battlefield collapse into the final phase of human and institutional disintegration. The decisive turning point of the Uman disaster occurred between 13 and 17 August 1941, when the last remaining possibility of organized Soviet breakout disappeared and the encircled formation shifted irreversibly from attempted maneuver to mass capitulation. By this stage, no continuous Soviet defensive line existed inside the former pocket. The remaining forces were dispersed across an area exceeding 900 square kilometers without unified command, coordinated logistics, or functional communications. On 13 August, German command issued formal orders to transition from pocket reduction to large-scale capture operations. The primary objective became the systematic interception of dispersed Soviet formations attempting independent escape. Infantry divisions of the 17th Army and security regiments were assigned grid-based sweep zones. These zones were segmented into 5 by 5 kilometer sectors, each subjected to continuous patrol, aerial reconnaissance, and village inspections. Motorized units sealed major dirt road corridors leading east toward the Dnieper crossings. The final organized Soviet breakout attempt occurred during the night of 14 through 15 August near the forest belt east of Kopinkovare. Approximately 8,000 Soviet troops, primarily from remnants of the 12th Army, attempted a coordinated eastward thrust in 4 parallel columns. The movement was detected at 0140 hours by German forward listening posts and confirmed by flare illumination and aerial reconnaissance after dawn. German infantry and light artillery units blocked the escape routes within 12 kilometers of movement. By the afternoon of 15th August, the breakout force had disintegrated under sustained fire. German reports recorded approximately 1,700 killed and wounded, and more than 5,000 captured from this single failed attempt. Fewer than 500 individuals succeeded in penetrating outer security zones. Following this failure, organized resistance ceased as a coordinated military phenomenon. On 16th August, formal surrender negotiations began at multiple localized points without centralized authority. Individual commanders, political officers, and surviving staff elements initiated capitulation independently. Red Army identification cards, weapons, and insignia were discarded en masse near stream beds, ravines, and abandoned farm structures. German processing teams established provisional collection camps near Podvisok, Novarkhangelsk, and Uman itself. The largest single concentration of prisoners occurred between 16 and 18 August, when German formations recorded the capture of approximately 70,000 Soviet personnel in a 3-day period. These included surviving combat troops, rear service personnel, medical staff, and a significant number of civilian auxiliaries attached to transport and supply units. Among the captured were Lieutenant General Ivan Muzichenko, commander of the 6th Army, and Major General Pavel Ponedelin, commander of the 12th Army. Their capture formally marked the complete operational destruction of both armies as functioning command entities. Inside the former pocket, the visible signs of collapse were extensive. Over 1,200 artillery pieces, mortars, and heavy machine guns were counted abandoned or destroyed between 12 and 18 August. Vehicle losses included more than 2,000 trucks and tractors left intact, but without fuel or spare parts. Ammunition stockpiles had been expended or deliberately destroyed to prevent capture. Medical facilities inside the pocket ceased functioning entirely by 15th August. Civilian conditions worsened sharply during this phase, with military movement concentrated into capture zones, food requisition intensified. Thousands of wounded Soviet soldiers remained untreated in open terrain or makeshift shelters. Post-war Soviet figures indicate that civilian fatalities inside the pocket during the final 10 days of collapse exceeded 3,000 due to exhaustion, untreated injuries, dehydration, and crossfire exposure. By 18th August 1941, the German command declared the Uman encirclement formally liquidated. All remaining resistance had been reduced to isolated escape attempts by small groups operating independently in forest and ravine zones. The turning point was no longer measured in territory gained or lost, but in the irreversible transition from organized military conflict to mass capture and humanitarian catastrophe. After the liquidation of organized resistance between 16 and 18 August 1941, the area of the former Uman pocket entered a post-combat phase defined by mass captivity, forced movement, and immediate humanitarian collapse. German authorities initiated the large-scale transfer of prisoners of war east to west toward temporary collection points and rear area transit camps. Between 18 and 25 August, German records indicate that approximately 103,000 to 108,000 Soviet personnel were registered as captured in the Uman sector, including combat troops, logistical units, and medical staff. The actual number of captives exceeded this figure due to unregistered deaths during initial transit. The first stage of prisoner movement took place entirely on foot. March columns were formed with intervals of 300 to 500 meters between groups. Daily march distances ranged from 18 to 25 kilometers. Food distribution during the first week of captivity was irregular. German field rations allocated to prisoners averaged below 300 calories per day. Water access depended on wells and surface sources along the route. Medical treatment for wounded prisoners was not organized at scale during this phase. Post-war Soviet medical analysis concluded that between 8,000 and 10,000 prisoners died during the first 7 days of forced marches due to untreated wounds, dehydration, and exhaustion. Temporary holding areas were established near Uman, Kristinivka, and Haisin. These open-air enclosure zones lacked permanent shelter. Prisoners were concentrated in densities exceeding 20 persons per 10 square meters in some locations. Sanitation infrastructure was absent. Disease spread rapidly under late summer temperatures that exceeded 30 degrees Celsius during the last week of August. Dysentery and typhus symptoms were recorded within days. German medical detachments conducted only limited quarantine measures. Mortality during the first 2 weeks inside these transit enclosures exceeded 12% of the registered captive population. The movement of prisoners continued westward toward permanent camps in occupied Poland and western Ukraine. Rail transport shortages forced the majority of transfers to remain on foot until early September. Mortality during secondary transfers remained high. Contemporary German logistics reports acknowledged the loss of thousands of prisoners during transit, but classified these losses as non-combat attrition rather than formal casualties. For the civilian population in the Uman region, the aftermath of the encirclement brought immediate occupation rule. German military administration imposed strict movement controls and food requisition quotas. Agricultural reserves, livestock, and grain stocks were seized to supply frontline formations advancing toward the Dnieper and to support rear area logistics. Local Soviet administrative structures had fully ceased to function by 20 August. Civilian displacement reached approximately 85,000 individuals across surrounding districts in the final 2 weeks of August alone. Security operations continued throughout late August and September to intercept remaining escape groups. German rear area patrol logs record the capture of an additional 7,000 to 9,000 Soviet soldiers during this period. Armed resistance in the region fell to sporadic incidents involving small partisan-style groups operating without stable supply or command structure. Recorded German casualties from such engagements during September totaled fewer than 60 personnel. The evacuation of German frontline units from the Uman sector proceeded gradually from late August into early September. Motorized and panzer formations were redeployed eastward toward the Dnieper crossings and the Kiev operational axis. Infantry divisions assumed occupation and security roles. Infrastructure repair focused on road and rail conversion to sustain continued advance operations deeper into Soviet territory. By mid-September 1941, the battlefield phase of the Uman disaster had fully transitioned into its post-operational consequences: mass captivity, population displacement, and the imposition of occupation control. The retreat and destruction of the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies were complete, not only as field forces but as organized institutional entities within the Red Army order of battle. The Uman disaster became one of the first large-scale operational catastrophes for the Red Army on Ukrainian territory and a defining episode of the opening phase of the German-Soviet War. Between late July and mid-August 1941, the complete destruction of the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies removed two full field formations from the order of battle of the Southwestern Front. Combined Soviet losses in the encirclement, including killed, wounded, captured, and missing, are estimated at between 140,000 and 160,000 personnel. German and Romanian losses during the entire Uman operation are estimated at approximately 15,000 to 20,000 killed and wounded. From a strategic perspective, the destruction of these two Soviet armies opened the operational depth of central Ukraine to Army Group South. With the Soviet southern wing effectively eliminated west of the Dnieper, German forces were able to accelerate their advance toward Kiev from the south and southeast. This created the southern pincer that later contributed directly to the much larger encirclement at Kiev in September 1941, where additional Soviet forces exceeding 400,000 personnel were lost. The collapse near Uman therefore did not remain an isolated defeat, but became part of a cascading sequence of encirclements that reshaped the entire southern axis of Operation Barbarossa. The disaster also exposed structural weaknesses in Red Army operational doctrine during the summer of 1941. Field formations lacked flexible withdrawal planning, reserve coordination, and secure communications under conditions of deep mobile warfare. The loss of mechanized corps west of the Bug and the inability to redeploy artillery and transport during retreat revealed the vulnerability of Soviet forces to simultaneous air interdiction and armored maneuver. These deficiencies became the subject of extensive internal analysis during the winter of 1941-1942, leading to later reforms in command structure, operational depth, and reserve deployment. The fate of the captured Soviet commanders became a long-term political and military issue. Lieutenant General Ivan Muzichenko and Major General Pavel Ponedelin both survived captivity. After the war, Ponedelin was arrested and executed in 1950 under charges of surrender and failure of command. Muzichenko was also imprisoned but later released during the post-Stalin rehabilitation period. Their cases reflected the broader Soviet policy of collective responsibility for defeat, in which surrender under encirclement was treated as a criminal act regardless of operational conditions. For the civilian population of the region, Uman marked the beginning of a prolonged occupation, accompanied by economic exploitation, forced labor, and political repression. Agricultural outputs were redirected to German logistical channels. Thousands of civilians were later deported for labor service in occupied Europe. Jewish communities in and around Uman were systematically exterminated in mass executions during the autumn of 1941 as part of the broader Nazi occupation policy in Ukraine. Post-war demographic surveys indicate that several districts surrounding Uman lost between 25 and 40% of their pre-war population by 1944 due to combined effects of killings, deportations, combat, and famine. In German military historiography, Uman was initially presented as a textbook example of mobile encirclement and operational annihilation. The operation reinforced confidence in deep armored maneuver and supported the belief that successive large Soviet formations could be destroyed west of the Dnieper. This perception influenced German planning priorities during August and September 1941, particularly the decision to pursue large encirclements over rapid direct drives toward strategic objectives farther east. In Soviet post-war historiography, Uman received far less attention than later battles such as Kiev, Stalingrad, and Kursk. For decades, the destruction of the 6th and 12th Armies was discussed only in fragmented form, often without detailed casualty figures or operational analysis. Only after the opening of archives in the 1990s did more precise reconstructions of the encirclement and its scale become available to researchers. Today, the Uman disaster is examined as an early demonstration of both the destructive efficiency of German mobile warfare in 1941 and the catastrophic consequences of Soviet command disintegration during the initial months of invasion. It stands as one of the first major operational collapses of the Red Army in Ukraine, and as a precursor to the much larger defeats that followed in the same year.